is Pam Myers, and I'm here to welcome you to our talk today, sponsored by the West Tonka Historical Society, and to welcome Lisa Mayotte, who is going to speak to us today about Maud Hart Lovelace. Thanks for coming, and welcome, Lisa.
And thank you all very much. I'm really happy to be here today to discuss one of my favorite authors, and I hope yours too, Maud Hart Lovelace, and to discuss her relationship with Lake Minnetonka, which is a little bit different than subjects that we usually address with Maud Hart Lovelace. But let's get an idea. How many of you have read some of the Betsy-Tacy books? Yay! How many of you have read all of the Betsy-Tacy books? Yay! Wonderful. Okay, now here's the challenging test. How many of you have read some of her adult books? Whoa, I have the crowd here that I wanted. All of you. Whether this is your first time ever hearing of her or if you've read them straight through. So I'm very, very glad that you're here. I've attended and been a part of many events based on Maud Hart Lovelace's books, but as I said, this will be a little different because it's just about the lake. And we had the Maud Hart Lovelace Society. There's two societies, the Maud Hart Lovelace Society and the Betsy-Tacy Society, and the Betsy-Tacy Society is the homeland in Mankato, of course, but we had a wonderful group here in Minneapolis, St. Paul for years and years and years, and now we've kind of blended into that group as well. But they had an event here that we'll talk about a little bit later on, but it's not as much a part of the Betsy-Tacy books. It's this much of one chapter of the 10 Betsy-Tacy books that are best known. One tiny chapter. So that's what I've had to do. So I took out my Nancy Drew hat and had to sleuth around and find some information. And I headed over to the Historical Society, and now I even have a research card, so you can do that too, and it's great fun to be able to do that. So we'll kind of wander down a meandering path. She wrote the books longhand, or she wrote a lot of her books, her original stories longhand, and later on finally got a typewriter when she was in her early, late teens, early 20s. So, who needs this technology? I do today. Okay, so before we can talk about Lake Minnetonka and Maud, we need to start at the very beginning, in Mankato, where she was born 130 years ago in April, on April 25th, 1892. So her 100th birthday, 30th birthday just passed. And although it's written that she was born on the 25th, in reality, she was born on the 26th, which she didn't learn about until much later. Her mother, her uncle, was engaged to a young woman named Maud, and her mother was very fond of this Maud. And as her due day approached, and that Maud's birthday approached, she said if the baby was born on that Maud's birthday, that they would name the baby Maud. Well, she went into labor on the 25th and went just a little past midnight, but it was a home birth, so they wrote it down as the 25th, and that was her birthday. Now, Maud was shocked by this news when she learned it at age 50, but at that point there was nothing to be done about it. And she loved that Aunt Maud too, so it was just one of those little family stories. So here you can see Betsy, Tacy, and Tib, or Maud, Bick, and, Thelma Benoni, Midge, May, thank you, I was going to say, the minute to be forgetting the name. So we've got up in the back, we've got Bick, or Tacy, and you can see that she's got the lovely Irish eyes that Maud always talks about in the books. And we've got Tib down here on the bottom. She's got that blonde German hair. She was only 5 feet tall, and she was the one with all sorts of energy. Where the other two dreamed up things to do, Tib was the one that actually got them to do it. And so together they were a terrific trio. And in later years, she added in more friends when they went into the high school books, and it didn't disrupt any of the earlier friendships. It was wonderful the way they were able to keep adding on these friends, and they had, if you read the books, and so many of you have, the high school years are just kind of giddy years. And however, I want you to know that there were subjects that were very very meaningful and real issues, such as when Bick loses a younger sister to diphtheria when they were young children, and when they met a young woman from Syria that lived in their town. And we don't have an actual photo of that young woman, but we have the beautiful illustrations by Lois Lenski so that you can see how she was depicted. And the Syrian themes carried on into other books as well. She mentioned them in another book called Emily of the Deep Valley, which really highlighted the Syrian friends. And that was it was kind of a Deep Valley book, but not an official Betsy-Tacy, one of the 10. And then another issue that came up was that her dear friend Cab's father died when he was going to be a senior in high school, and he had to leave school and take on the family business. So there were things that were going around that were actually things that were moving and made you realize that these people had real lives and not just great adventures in Deep Valley, although that was quite a bit of it. And I'm going to show you one more picture here, just because you have to see, how they were depicted in their high school years. And the pictures are just beautiful. Wouldn't you love to be depicted by this illustrator, Vera Neville? And the clothes. She studied all the photographs that Maud had put into photo albums, and Maud was very strong at putting everything into photo albums. So she was able to copy things right down to the umbrellas and the little suitcases and hat boxes that they had, which is, gives so much substance to the books as well. So Maud always said that the Betsy-Tacy books, especially the Mankato books, were fiction that paralleled life. But she had to make up one character in the books completely, in the high school books completely, and that was Joe Willard, whose story was based on that of her future husband, Delos Lovelace. I'm going to tell you, sometimes I'll say Delos, sometimes I might say Delos. We always kind of go back and forth. We kind of came up with Delos for this one, but if I slip, you'll understand. So what high school story would not be complete without the potential boyfriend? Her sometimes nemesis, always has to be, who also happens to be the most handsome, intellectual, and mature character in the high school book years. Who of us women, when we read the books since childhood, did not seek out our Joe Willard in our lives? So it was for Maud, and it didn't come in high school. It came later when she was working. And so we have to put him on hold for a bit right now. We can't go on with him as much as we'd like to. Let me see, I think I have a photo. We'll go back to, we'll go on to this photo so you can see the family while we're going on. It sometimes comes as a shock to us readers to find out that Mauds family left Mankato. We pick up, she goes right through her high school years. Suddenly she's going off to a new adventure, but she's not living in Deep Valley or Mankato anymore. And that it was astounding when I was a child and was reading these. Now I'm more used to it, and you begin to understand why. And you even find out happily and in true life that Bick's family moved to Minneapolis too. That was really very handy. But when you think about it, it might not be such a shock, because how many of you actually come from outside of the Twin Cities and then moved here? I know I did, okay. So you have a treasured hometown that you remember and that you could probably write about as Maud did. And my hometown was Neenah, Wisconsin, as she nicely said. It's near Green Bay. Yes, Packer territory. But like Betsy, I came here to attend the University of Minnesota, where I met my Joe in German class in Fowell Hall. And we've been married for almost 40 years. And I've stayed here ever since. Maud's family left Mankato as her father had sold the store, lost an election, and had better prospects in the cities, while at the same time the girls were beginning to go to the university. So it was perfect that they could be right there, live at home or live on college, and be very close to their families. It was a good time to be able to keep the family together. So you can see the family here. And this is her father, her younger sister, in the book, Margaret, but in real life, Helen, and Betsy is in the middle, or Maud, and they're reading a letter from Europe that was written by her older sister, whose real name was Kathleen, and her mother, and then her grandmother. They always had, relatives around the house. So Julia was the older sister in the books, and they had rivalry as children, and they got to be best friends when they were in high school. So it was great that not only did she have great school friends, but really a strong family as well. So we're going to take another deviation before Maud meets up with Lake Minnetonka and Delos. But it seems really relevant for us here in the US and throughout the world. Maud did not feel like she was succeeding at university, so she decided in 1914 to sail for Europe. In January 1914, she sailed to Europe as her sister had done many years before. In fact, in 1909, Kathleen went to Germany because she was going to be an opera singer. And you go to the Historical Society, I've got copies now of all of Kathleen's letters that she wrote to her family from Europe, which are just so much fun to read. And I have copies, but I haven't printed them all out yet, of Maud's letters that she sent from Germany and from Europe. So Betsy's experience is replicated almost word for word for the letters that she sent home, and in the book, Betsy and the Great World, which is one of my favorites, where she focuses on her experience in Germany, Venice, Paris, and London. Over a third of the book takes place in Munich, and after her amazing ocean crossing, no cramped 8-hour flight for her. And here we have a fun picture of her there on the boat. Is this how we dress when we travel? Not quite. Well, and here she learns to make new friends and love Munich, but there is the constant background of German soldiers everywhere and people talking about military alliances and what might happen if war is declared. And something that seems absurd to her in these modern times. When she is in London, at the end of the book, or World War I, or as it was known then, the Great War is declared. We even get to see Maud going through the unique experience of having to find a passage on a ship back to the United States as hundreds of Americans flee from Europe. Does this remind you of anything that's been going on recently? Sadly, yes. The more things change, the more they stay the same. But here comes the fun part. After Maud returns to Minneapolis, she eventually goes to work at the Wakefield Publicity Bureau, where or in the book called the Hawthorne Publicity Bureau, in the book Betsy's Wedding, where she takes over the job of a former associate. Lillian Wakefield, the director, told Maud to look over a collection of articles to see the sort of work that the Bureau was doing, and Maud became aware of the writer that she replaced, Delos Lovelace, whose name she thought sounded like a Valentine, and even sounds more like a Valentine later when she added the heart in the middle, the heart to Lovelace, so Maud Hart Lovelace. And Lillian was quite the matchmaker and invited them to dinner, and it was love at first sight. And interestingly enough, the book Betsy's Wedding is dedicated to Lillian, so she really appreciated this matchmaking. Okay, so let's take a look here. Take a look at the young man seated across the table from Maud. This picture of Maud is the one, we have a picture of the two of them illustrated, but here we go. This picture is the picture that Delos carried with him of Maud to the war. And this is him in his uniform. Don't uniforms always make the man or woman? So he was born in Brainerd, Minnesota, and by the time he had met Maud in May of 1917, I'm telling these dates because they kind of don't coincide exactly from the books, but she makes it work. He was a newspaper reporter of some experience, having worked at the Fargo Courier, the Minneapolis Daily News, and the Minneapolis Tribune. By 1917, he had joined the first officers' training camp at Fort Snelling and was preparing to go overseas. The Delos who emerges from the novels is an energetic, ambitious, and strong-willed man. In his ambition for himself and for his wife, he and Maud were one. Maud said, "I was always brought up to believe that somebody in the family should have the final word in any discussion, and I thought that person should be Delos." She said, "If he hadn't wanted me to be a writer, I wouldn't have been one." When somebody said, if he hadn't wanted her to be a writer, she wouldn't have married him, she said, "You're probably right." So they met in May 1917. They married in November 1917. A whirlwind romance that's replicated in Betsy's wedding. Maud wrote the book to work out so that they married the minute that she returned from Europe in 1914, and at the end, he was heading off to the Great War in 1917. So where does this lead us? To a fictitious but romantic honeymoon on Lake Minnetonka, right outside the window here. And before we dive into the honeymoon, let's dive into the lake. The Dakota people understood Lake Minnetonka's allure, and that's why they kept it secret from the white man occupying Mayotte, which the newcomers called Fort Anthony and which we now call Fort Snelling. But such a massive natural attraction of 14,000-acre lake just 15 miles northwest of Fort Snelling at the headways of the Minnehaha Creek couldn't stay hidden forever. In 1822, the teenage son of Colonel Josiah Snelling took a canoe along with a friend of his up the Minnehaha Creek, supposedly becoming the first white people to set eyes on the lake. Even then, it somehow managed to avoid further major notice for the next 30 years. That is until Governor Alexander Ramney christened it Lake Minnetonka in 1852. Within 2 years, most of the 125 plus miles of the shoreline had been claimed or bought. So here you can see the lake. Now let's go back and look at dates. Maud and Delos married on Thanksgiving Day in 1917 so that they could have a 3-night honeymoon before he returned to Fort Snelling. In the book, that wedding was moved to September because this is where Minnetonka gets its starring role. In the book, the honeymoon was on the shores of Lake Minnetonka. Maud and Delos were very fond of the lake, so she set the honeymoon in a cabin there. They said that the hotels were closed in September, which may have been true. So they were able to use Tacy and her husband's cottage. Tacy and her husband in the book were living in an apartment in the city, and Bick at that time wasn't engaged or married. But the made-up cottage fortunately looked like a house that they had rented on Jennings Bay in 1921, which was green and perched on stilts. Exact address is sadly unknown. Pre-automobile, Lake Minnetonka shut down during winter, and it doesn't take a lot of imagination to know why she moved the date from November to September. With lots of snow and lack of wintertime public transportation, November would not lend itself to make a very good honeymoon, especially in a non-insulated house. But September usually is gorgeous. I'm a sailboat racer at the Wayzata Yacht Club, and we race until the end of October, but September racing is some of the most beautiful with all the leaves changing. It's usually perfect weather. So it was just great for a honeymoon. The streetcar boats might have still been running, actually, at that time, too. Young girls all over the U.S. grow up knowing about the Minnetonka streetcar boats, although we probably couldn't quite imagine what they looked like. How many of you were here 2 months ago for the streetcar boat lecture? I thought it was great, although they co-opted some of the information that I thought I wanted to use, but that was wonderful because I loved what they had to say. At the end of their 3-night honeymoon, Betsy and Joe took a streetcar boat back to the landing where they caught a Minneapolis streetcar to come back home. Here's a glance of what that would look like. Okay, let's take a look at this. How many of you would like to be wearing those long white dresses standing on that rather narrow-looking dock, stepping on to a streetcar in a crowd? Doesn't it look like somebody's going to go over the edge in a minute? That wouldn't be my idea of a good time, but I guess they didn't go over the edge, and people did this all the time. And here's a picture of them showing what they would use for an advertisement, because this would make you really want to come. Much better, isn't it? Let me read you a few paragraphs from the honeymoon chapter of the book, which is entitled The Golden World. The name of the title of this chapter is from As You Like It by William Shakespeare. And the golden world was the idea of living in the woods, as Robin Hood did, with idealized pastoral life, simplicity, love, purity, and honesty. Here is a bit of Shakespeare from As You Like It. They say he is already in the forest of Arden, and many merry men with him, and there they live like old Robin Hood of England. They say many young gentlemen flock to him every day, and fleet the time carelessly, as they did in the golden world. Joe, and I'm sure Delos, must have written this in a gift of the book As You Like It, saying, we'll fleet the time carelessly as they did in the golden world. Who could resist such a romantic line? And now let's take a delicate peek into the honeymoon. I'll just read you a tiny bit from the book. This is where they're at the cabin, and he's gone for a swim, coming out of the lake in September. Colder than the blazes, he said, blowing and snorting and rubbing vigorously. He sat down beside her. Do you know what I was thinking out there? It would be fun to live in a place like this. It would be perfect, Betsy cried, just perfect for 2 writers. Let's buy that place with the Japanese boathouse. All right, said Joe. Of course, first, I have to earn the money. And we'll travel. Before we settle down, we might travel a bit. New Orleans, California, have a fling at New York. Would you like that? I'd love it, Betsy answered. But we won't stay. No, we'll come back here to Lake Minnetonka and write. It was beautiful sitting on the dock in the sunshine, planning out their lives, but they had to go in. They had to have an early supper and pack and row over to the streetcar boat landing. They went down the steps to the rowboat where Joe stowed away the bags. He got out the oars and slipped them into the oarlocks. I haven't taken one of those streetcar boats for years, he said as they pushed off. They're yellow like streetcars. They're fun. And the streetcars going in from Minnetonka are fun too. They go like lightning. And there's one motorman, or used to be, who puts his hand behind his head and doesn't touch the wheel. He's probably been fired by now. They talked fast and didn't look back at the cottage. They kept talking so long that they almost missed the streetcar boat, which took them to the streetcar, where they sat on the back seat and held each other's hands. The motorman drove with his hands behind his head, but Betsy and Joe didn't even notice. Maud and Delos did go back and buy a house on Minnetonka in 1924. This one, which is located at 2525 Dunwoody Point on Casco Point. right across the bridge and across the bay over there. Oh, am I pointing the wrong direction? Oh, okay. Like the scarecrow. Okay. They didn't stay out there much in the winter, but I love this picture that I took just this past spring when I found out I was going to be giving this talk. Maud referred to the point as Indian Point, which faces west on Spring Park Bay. Delos was by then working freelance and writing many short stories, so that he wouldn't have to make the trip to town by the streetcar boat and by the streetcar into a Minneapolis office. And so here's the house. They're not on stilts. The lakefront house that Maud and Delos bought overlooks the lake from the top of a high bank, like Betsy and Joe's honeymoon cottage. The house also has a steep flight of steps which go down to the lake. As you can see here, and you'll see another picture looking the other direction. The house bank here was high over the water. Betsy and Joe's honeymoon cottage was probably something of a cross between the Jennings Bay house that they rented and their Costco Point cottage bought a few years later. Okay, so I'll just take a look at them. Oh, here's the porch, which was screened and now has been glassed in. And here, okay, are Maud and Delos sitting on their front steps and looking out over the bay. When it was time for them to sell the house, the son of the new owner recalled that at the time that his parents purchased the house, it had been winterized, but not thoroughly. The Lovelaces used it mostly in the summer. And speaking of new owners, when word of this talk got out, I was contacted by Sue Schwalbach, who owned this house from 1995 to 2001. Any Maud Hart Lovelace members here remember the time of the excursion to Lake Minnetonka? You weren't there? Okay. Anybody else? No, I was out of town, and I always regretted not being there. But when I talked to Sue, she related a very interesting story. First of all, she had read all the books and owned them all, and decided that Maud's office was the small room up on the second floor overlooking the lake. She thinks that Maud made her presence known in the house while she was living there, while Sue was living there, as the door of the room opened and closed. She didn't quite say the word ghost or spirit, but it came up in our conversation. And what better place for Maud's spirit to be than writing and overlooking this lake? So you can see from the pictures that the Lovelaces did not buy a Japanese boathouse. There were two relatively well-known boathouses on the lake at that time. The one that most of us know is the Nuremberg boathouse on Crystal Bay. We probably have all been in and out it since. It's been lovely to have been donated to the Three Rivers Park system, and it's a wonderful place to be able to go and see their gorgeous flowers and to stand in this Japanese boathouse. This one was built in 1907. But when the Lovelaces lived on the lake, they might not have known about this, as the streetcar boats did not go into this bay. So I'm not sure if they had access to other means to get around the lake. They may have been able to have seen it from the street, but it's not that easy to see. They wouldn't have known it as well. But there's the other one that's on Robbins, is the Robbins Scott Boathouse, which is well known for being on the cover of Boathouses of Minnetonka. And the streetcar boat line did pass this house. I thought I had put another map of the lake right in here. I thought I dropped it in. Nope, didn't. So anyways, the streetcar line does go down to where this house was, and that landing was then called Wood Lake, so that they would, or Woodhouse, they would be able to have seen this one right from the streetcar boat, and I can imagine that they loved being able to look at that one. But because Maud had a vivid imagination, I have a totally unbiased thought that the house with the Japanese boathouse that they could have seen from their house or their dock might have been that of a neighbor, a house built on Casco Point by the Maxwells of Kansas City, which had a Japanese style roof. Not the whole thing looks Japanese, but the roof definitely does. The house was destroyed in that tornado of 1965, but the present owner believes that this boathouse is around 100 years old, which puts it in Maud's Lake Minnetonka life. I discussed this theory with Sue, the previous owner that I just talked about, and she thought the same thing. So maybe this was the Japanese boathouse that they had dreamed of. But there's another prominent place here on the lake that is featured in Betsy's wedding, and that is the Inn on Christmas Lake. For those of you who have read the book, you remember that this is where they went for a big dance, and Tib might be getting engaged at this hotel, although it didn't happen. And this hotel is, although it's called the Inn on Christmas Lake, it's most certainly the Glen Morris Inn. And it's a sophisticated inn which tended to be rustic because it was in the country, and it was one of their favorite places. The inn was originally a home owned by the Glen Morris family, which was remodeled and opened as a hotel with an excellent restaurant and private cabins in 1906. In 1920, the house was then sold and became the Radisson Inn on the lake, a sister to the Minneapolis Radisson Hotel. That was something new to me, but maybe others of you had known that as well. Sadly, it was sold again during the Depression when it fell from its high standards and became a place of gambling machines and financial woes. As with so many lake hotels, it succumbed to fire in 1936, where the local fire department could not arrive in time to save the very flammable wooden building. Some of the private cabins still remain there and have been winterized, and you can still see them along the shore of Christmas Lake. Now there is, here, let me see, I have another great little photograph. This is the one I think is so beautiful. You can just see Tim and Mr. Bagshaw running down the pathway to have the infamous proposal that she refused. Okay, so, but there's another hotel. This one was the Hotel del Otoro, which I believe must have been in Maud and Delos's life. As it is located, it would have been located right where the condominium, the Mists, would have stood. Oh, yeah, I keep pointing this direction. Okay, yes, over here, the Mists would have stood. And it was right up the street from where they lived. So, and then the Hotel del Otoro means Hotel of the Mounds, very appropriate. So this was the second James J. Gill property after he built the Hotel Lafayette and was designed to draw patrons further west on the Great Northern Railway that he owned. I love this quote from the historian Theodore Blegan in his memoir of his boyhood on the lake. On one side was the famed Hotel del Otoro, with its glimpse of a world of fashion and wealth and ease, as we thought, a society of finery, outside experience, definitely more elegant than the crowds on the picnic grounds. As we walked slowly past, we liked to look a little enviously at the elegant men and ladies playing croquet on the hotel's ground. It's so much fun to think of a young child looking at that. And this hotel was located just up the road, and I wouldn't be surprised if we read some of Delos's short stories and found something based on that. I don't know that that's true, but it just seemed like something that he would do. And surely they must have stole away from their writing for a dance at the dance hall. I'm not sure if they would have gone to the casino, but why not? It too burned down, as did almost every hotel at Lake Minnetonka built in these years, too far, as we said again, from the fire stations. But the mention of insurance begins to come up about this point and is raised in many of these hotel fires. The hotels just weren't bringing in the crowds as people were beginning to live out at the lakes, and well, if they had to go, they had to go. So we're meandering more than the Minnetonka Creek, but a few more interesting bits of information about Delos. In 1918, Delos was sent to France as a second lieutenant in the 339th Machine Gun Battalion, where he was exposed to the infamous mustard gas. So these are not his, but these were my husband's grandfather. So he would have had a helmet like this. And I invite you afterwards to try to put one of these on and then imagine wearing this all day long and running around in the heat and the battles of Europe. It would have been overwhelming. And even more important for the people at that time would have been the gas mask. The Germans had developed a nefarious tool, the gassing that was going on. We probably were developing too. I don't want to point fingers at the Germans, but they were necessary to have during the war, and you'll hear in a minute about this. When the war ended, the Army sent him to Trinity College in Cambridge for 4 months of study while he waited for space on a troop ship to come home, which became available in 1919. I think that sounds pretty great, but of course he was desperate to get back to his bride. He had been overseas for what I'm sure seemed like a very long 11 months, and he served in the Army for 27 months. He worked at newspapers in Minneapolis and eventually New York City. It was in New York City that he became ill, and the doctor made him take time off due to a weakness in his lungs from the gas. Now, when you think that you may not have heard of Delos Lovelace, it turns out that you probably have. How many of you thought of Delos aside from the Maud Hart Lovelace books? I'll have to say, you know where I'm going? Do you know where I'm going with this? Okay. Well, and also if you watch Minnesota Public Television, which I'm sure a lot of you do, you may have seen this little commercial that came up where they mentioned that his most famous book, I'm sure he wouldn't be really happy about this, but it is, that he adapted for his dear friend Miriam Cooper, who had created the famous movie King Kong. So here you can see Delos Lovelace. He had written the book that they had to have a book along with the movie, it went together. And Miriam Cooper, needed this book version, and he was a very good friend of Delos, so he asked him to do this. But recently, Minnesota Public Television came across the fact that neither Miriam Cooper nor Delos had copyrighted his book. So it became public domain after 30 years. And in the 80s, a video game showed up, Donkey Kong, not exactly our years, but you might have had children or grandchildren that loved Donkey Kong. This was based on King Kong, and they went into a little bit of copyright debate before they found out it hadn't been copyrighted. And Donkey Kong is now worth $10 billion. Delos was paid $600 for the book, which at that time was very good. And since there are no direct heirs to the family mourning the loss of this fortune, maybe it's just kind of an interesting story. Buying the Casco Point house seems to have brought luck to the Lovelaces. In 1926, Maud published her first book, The Blue Angels, about a group of traveling singers in southern Minnesota, and it was very well received. Maud was an avid local historian, and she loved the history of Minnesota, especially southern Minnesota. Her next book, Early Candlelight, was set in and around Fort Snelling in the 1830s. This was an extremely popular book, published in August of 1926, and Maud was invited to a military parade in her honor at Fort Snelling. This is the first time that an American regiment accorded such a tribute to a civilian woman. And you can see her here. She was very worried about going through this ceremony, but she was reassured that all she would have to do is stand next to the colonel. There she is, standing right next to the colonel. That was her role. 15 companies, led by a band, swung into line and marched before her, banners flying. Maud thought that this was one of the highlights of her career. The book was reprinted in 1949 as part of the celebration marking Minnesota's Territory Centennial. Early Candlelight was Maud's biggest success among her work of historical fiction, and the novel most remembered by her adult readers. Let's take a look at all the books. Here are her adult books. She then wrote 2 books not set in Minnesota. One, Petticoat Court, which was set in Paris and was based on stories that her grandmother had told her about seeing the Empress Eugenie in the Luxembourg Gardens when she had visited France many years before. And the Charming Sally, which was about a singing family in Philadelphia before returning to her roots and collaborating with Delos. So the last 2 books, One Stayed at Welcome and Gentlemen from England, were collaborated on with Delos. So you can see that they both have their names on the books here. One Stayed at Welcome was more or less set in Eden Prairie. Maud didn't know that there was actually a Minnesota town called Welcome. Can you believe that? Not that it's a big town, but it gets around. And Gentlemen from England was about a group of exiled British gentry who bring red-coated fox hunting to Minnesota prairies. It has some fun scenes of local farmers standing in their fields and watching the British lords on a fox hunt. Can you imagine that, just driving along down by Worthington and seeing this taking place? Thanks to interested Betsy-Tacy groups, several of her adult books have been reprinted, and all of them are currently available in the Hennepin County Library. I checked on that, and even checked out the Charming Sally to see if it would actually come, because there was only 1 copy, and I thought, oh, it's just there out of generosity, but nope, came to my house. I might be biased, you think, but she is remembered for her Betsy-Tacy books, which are a marvel. That stand the test of time. And I'll prove to you in a second, although when Maud was complimented on her Betsy-Tacy books, she did say, I am equally proud of my adult books. Okay, so Maud and Delos eventually did move to New York City, which they were planning to just visit and stay there, as we had heard, in their plans when they were on their honeymoon. But they stayed for a very long time. They loved living in the city. They loved going to the opera. They loved going to the symphony. They loved the feel of the city. They rented out their house on Lake Minnetonka, and they did plan to come back. But in 1939, they sold it. She also did not plan to write children's books, but when they had a daughter, Miriam Cooper Lovelace, named after his best friend, Miriam Cooper, who was the producer of King Kong. But when Miriam came along, Maud started to tell her stories about her childhood. And she even named herself Betsy, and she named her best friend Tacy in the stories that she was telling as bedtime stories. And so they led to the Betsy-Tacy books. And as Miriam grew, the books grew with her. So she had planned to end the books at Betsy and Tacy Go Downtown. So just with the first 4 books as, children's books, stories that she told to, very young people. But at that time, she received several boxes of her papers and her diaries, and her husband started to read them and said, oh, these are just too good. You have to bring Betsy through high school. And so she did. So you can see the next 4 books. Heaven to Betsy, Betsy in Spite of Herself, Betsy Was a Junior, and Betsy and Joe. And that's where she planned to finish it. If you read the last page of Betsy and Joe, it does kind of sound like an ending to the books. But her fans wouldn't let her stop, and they clamored to take her through college. Now, as you already know, that she had started at the University of Minnesota, hadn't really finished it, went to Europe, as we discussed, and then ended up getting married. So that's what happens in the books. All of these books were written in New York, except for Betsy's Wedding, which was written in California, but was written at the time that her daughter Miriam got married. Readers really wanted her to write another book, readers had a name, because in the book Betsy's Wedding they talk about when they might have a daughter named Patina. So she had thought of the name Betsy's Patina for her next book, but she said it was too complicated. They lived in New York. They didn't live in the Twin Cities. Miriam had been raised in New York, and Tacy had moved to Buffalo in New York. People had scattered. There wasn't something that she could really take from her experiences, so the books do end at Betsy's Wedding, although I'm sure some of us would have loved to have had them just go on and on. So, in case, when you tell people that you attended this speech and they ask incredulously, Maud Hart Lovelace, this is what you reply. These women are great fans of Maud. Judy Blume, Nora Ephron, who included a quote about Betsy and Tacy and Tib in You've Got Mail. Go watch it again. You'll see her pull the books off the shelf and discuss their names. And even our own author, Lorna Landvik. But let's go on here. Laura Lipman of the Baltimore Sun stated, I place Lovelace's books alongside Little Women, Anne of Green Gables, and Laura Ingalls Wilder's Little House series. No, that's inadequate. Lovelace's work is superior to that of Louisa May Alcott and Ellen Montgomery, equal to Wilder's. Let other women cry over Beth's death scene. Let the Japanese flock to Prince Edward Island in search of all things Anne. My heart belongs to Deep Valley, Minnesota, and the big hill where Betsy and Tacy picnic when the weather turns fair. Not to be outdone, the writer Anna Quinlan, right up here on your right, has said that she rereads the following writers annually: Jane Austen, Charles Dickens, and Maud Hart Lovelace, and has spoken at 2 conferences here in the Twin Cities, where I heard her say that she had given up a dinner at the White House with the president to come to Minnesota to the convention, which her husband said to her, he said, I don't understand this, and he had to ask, Maud Hart Lovelace? And Bette Midler said, I don't care how old I am, I will read and reread them again and again. So here you have some of your people to back up how you spent an hour today. But let's go back to Minnetonka and the what ifs in life. I have a family connection to Lake Minnetonka. My great-grandfather and great-grandmother, John Mathis, born in Switzerland. John Mathis was born in Switzerland in 1863, and Louise Berline was born in Chaska in 1868, and lived just off of Lake Minnetonka, outside of Zumbra, near Minnetrista, until my great-grandfather's death in 1942. Here's the family farmhouse. Look, this is how it looked when my great-grandparents were living there, and here it is today. And there's some family that says, there she is again, that woman that comes every 2 or 3 years to take an updated picture of the house to send all the cousins to show that it's still there. But my mother would go to the farm every summer from Coleraine, Minnesota, where she lived. And one of her happiest memories was picking vegetables. So you can see my great-grandfather here picking the vegetables, and you can see my mother tending to the chickens. She didn't like the chickens very much, but she did like picking the vegetables with her great-grandfather. Then she and her grandfather would roll over to Crane Island on Saturdays and set up a stand and sell the vegetables to the people who had homes on Crane Island. The people on Crane Island were there for the summer. There were a lot of teachers from the University of Minnesota that had houses on Crane Island, and they welcomed the fresh vegetables that this cute duo brought to them. My great uncle, who I knew very well, may have also brushed shoulders with Delos at Fort Snelling. Elmer Mathis, John and Louisa's son, served with the 5th Battalion Signal Corps in 1918. Here's the picture of that battalion Signal Corps. And early on, when I was reading the books, I didn't know what battalion Delos was in, so I spent hours looking at this, seeing if I could pick him out. And he's not there, since they were not in the same battalion, but what did I know at that time? But you can see his picture. I put the little blue slip so you can see my uncle there. And he started at Fort Snelling and got as far as New York City when peace treaty was signed. But he returned to Fort Snelling for a more dire purpose, which he told later in life directly to me and to my sisters. The Spanish influenza had reached Fort Snelling, and the hospital at Fort Snelling admitted its first case of influenza on September 27, 1918. Within 10 days, 850 patients had been admitted to the Fort Hospital, most with the flu. 200 of these developed pneumonia, and 61 of them died right at that time. My great uncle's job was to carry those who had died out of the hospital and pile them up behind the hospital, waiting for burial. My uncle was spared, as was Delos, fortunately for Maud and for all of us. On a lighter side, I have another picture of my great uncle here, because it's just too good a story. He was drafted for the Vietnam War when he was 75, and he had to go down to the draft board with his birth certificate and his service record to prove that not only was he too old to serve, but that he had already served 50 years earlier. And I think it's great that he had saved the hat for that occasion, and I wish that I had it now. So the streetcar boat went to Zumbra near Victoria, and did the adventurous Lovelaces perhaps get off in Zumbra and wander around, perhaps nod to my great-grandparents on a Sunday walk? We'll never know. But what we do know is that Maud Hart Lovelace, here's the boat, here are the boats going out there. So you can see it says Zumbra on one of these. But what we do know is that Maud Hart Lovelace had lasting memories of Lake Minnetonka, which will continue to be passed on to readers who want to visit this treasured place. Thank you very much.